I think we're at this really pivotal moment. I think we stand at a threshold moment that, studying church history, I think comes maybe once or twice a century. And we are in that moment right now. It's a pivot point where institutional Christianity is on the decline, 25 years of just hemorrhaging influence in America and the West. And then, as we have kind of an institutional decline, we have this really interesting stirring among the next generations, Gen Z and Millennials. We'll get into the stats shortly. But as I personally started to see more and more 18 to 20 to early 30s show up to church and having conversations with them, and you heard this in these emails, but it is the question that keeps driving me. Like, as they walk through the doors of our churches, what will they find? And will it be Jesus? And that question kept me up a little bit at night and shifted my trajectory. And so this is why I stepped in to this role. This is why I'm passionate about this mission of the Bonhoeffer Project. That's why we're doing this call right now, is to wrestle with this question and to learn what we can learn from the model of somebody who has been really impactful for me. I just finished Wesley's journals. Has anyone read Wesley's journals? You can raise your hand. I know I'm a guy who reads journals of old dead people, and you know, this is why I don't have too many friends. But it was a fantastic. Thanks, Elliot, a friend from Southern California. I appreciate it. You are my friend. Here's the thing.
What made you read it, Brandon? Like, does that relate to the state of today's market, today's marketplace?
Well, I didn't know at the time. I had somebody recommended, I think probably Bill, because that's been our ongoing conversation,
Mm-hmm.
recommendations of great things to read. And as I was reading it, I saw some of these similarities happen right in this moment. Right at this same moment as I was reading, I was like, wow, there's such similarities. So, what I would like to do today is we're going to talk through a little bit of Wesley's England, what Wesley's England looked like, look into some of the history there to set the context. We'll kind of compare that to some of our environmental realities today, and then we'll look at what Wesley did in response to all of this, and hopefully glean some learnings for what we ought to do at this pivotal moment in the West. That sound good? And then we'll end with some time for questions. So as you are working it through, feel free if you got any questions, pop them into the chat along the way, and I'll just kind of be watching that, or maybe Bill will be watching that, and we will do our best to kind of respond in kind. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Sounds good. All right. So, Bill, just to kick this off, um, we were talking a little bit around Wesley's England, what it was like. Would you kind of help me paint the picture for us a little bit of England in early 1700s? What was happening in the church and society? Not yet into what Wesley did about it, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, England at that time was, of course, split between primarily the gentry or, in the Victorian age. Well, not the Victorian age, was a lot later, but it was split between the landed gentry who owned property and who were educated in the places like Oxford and Cambridge and in a public education, they call it, which is really private education. And then the lower classes, the working class. And there was increasing disparity and bitterness. And they'd been through a civil war in the 1600s, but now resentment was growing again. And maybe one of the ways to look at it is that every sixth home in London was considered a pub, was licensed as a pub. So alcoholism was on the rise. The filth and the squalor and the difficulty of the lower classes' lives. They didn't have a lot of the kinds of conveniences we have today and the technology. So life was pretty bad at that level. And that was the environment. Now, Wesley came from a really upper middle class home. His father was a clergy because either you were a clergy or you were in the military, or these were the primary ways in which uh, people of the elites of the country would go into all these professions. But the people who were that Wesley reached were primarily of the working class. So that was kind of the situation, and we'll talk more about it as we go. But it was a very uh, tumultuous time politically, and people felt like maybe there was going to be another civil war. It was just a kind of brewing thing that uh, was going during that time.
Mhm. Yeah, after yeah, you've got these pieces where a lot of the farmlands were taken over, privatized, and so you had a lot of people moving in to cities, which results in this just moral decline. We know there's this gin epidemic at the time. Um, that note you had about like either you're in clergy, you're in military, or you're some type of political leader. Um, One of the stats that I heard was that uh, of the 11,000 pastors uh, that were on the pay structure for the Church of England,
Hmm.
6,000 of them had never even visited their parish.
Yeah.
And largely this is because the second son had to figure out what to do. And so a
Hmm.
lot of them were given these pastorates. And so you have this kind of church institution as kind of career choice that had very little to do with pastoring. And as a result, you have these masses. The working class, they didn't have pastors taking care of them in their parish, um, in the Church of England. And you could see why then there would be this latent hunger amidst moral decay, amidst lack of pastors pastoring. You have this kind of growing thirst and desire that would almost be like a tinderbox waiting to explode with Wesley's proclamations.
Yeah, and every inch of England was covered by the parish system, and they were all had a church and a clergy, and so there was everything was covered. But like you said, if you've never even visited your parish, because it was a political thing, and the government pays them and still pay them, basically in the Anglican Church.
Hmm. Yep. Right. So, okay. So that's Wesley's England. You have this massive issue. I saw a question about the era of opium use. Do you know anything about that, Bill?
I do not.
Yeah, I don't know. If you know, Charlie, please share. But um, you
Maybe Chris knows something about England since he lives there.
Um, we in New Jersey we have a addiction recovery and a Christian conference footprint, and it's a big place, and it's named after Keswick, which is spelled Keswick. So it came from England right at the turn of the 1900.
know.
And I go to a men's fellowship there, and they were talking about how opium overran
Yep.
uh, many aspects of England, Great Britain. It may have been in the early 1800s, but there was an addiction problem.
Yep. I think you're right, Charlie. I think it was a little bit later. Um, but yeah, so we have moral decay, we have a hungry people not being pastored, institutional decline, and kind of a loss. What we see there is the institution. There's a loss of Jesus, really, in the midst of all of this. And so I want to then jump to America today and just name some of the realities of what we are facing in this moment. So, Great Dechurching came out in 2023. There, different people have different thoughts on this, but generally it looks like the stats are correct there, that we've lost about 40 million people who have stopped attending church since 2000. So over the last 25 years, we've lost as many people Yeah, it's called The Great Dechurching is the book. It came out in 2023. Jim Davis and Michael Graham. Um, Based on the numbers, that looks like in about one in every 3 to 4 churchgoers in America lost over the last 25 years, which means we lost more churchgoers than were gained in both the first and second Great Awakenings and all the Billy Graham Crusades combined. So in the last 25 years, the American church as an institution has been on a rapid decline. And we've been reading these stats for the last 25 years, all these books from Barna and everything coming out, waving these red flags, saying things are not going in the direction we would hope that they would go. Um, these writers say this is the largest religious shift in American history. That's a major note to look at. Uh, we know so much is changing over the last 25 years with all the technological advances and all these things. But for us as pastors and ministry leaders to just look at that and to let that happen and not have that break our hearts and have us ask the question, what is going wrong? Um, is a huge miss. Um, and I believe that these 40 million people didn't leave because they lost interest in the spiritual, in purpose, in meaning. I think they've left because we've offered them Christianity without Christ. Going back to Bonhoeffer's words, we've built these religious institutions and put a lot of work into them. And in many ways, I think the American church has offered a gospel that is not the gospel that Jesus proclaimed. And if you've walked through Bonhoeffer Project Cohort, which you all have, we know, we agree on this. But let me just keep walking through the reality of this moment. So, uh, pastors are not doing well. 40% of pastors are at high risk of burnout. That's 2022 from Barna. That's up 11% from 2015. So that's a 400% increase in pastors experiencing burnout in the last 7 years. A lot of that was COVID. 42% of pastors seriously considered leaving ministry in the past year. Um, and then there's this support gap. Here's what's, obviously really important why Bonhoeffer Project, one central reason we exist is that 22% of pastors receive regular support. 75% report being extremely stressed or highly stressed. Um, in many ways, see what we're doing is we're asking pastors to pour out their lives, running their lives to sustain an institution that is declining, just numerically is declining. And then you add to that, again, this is just America in this moment, moral and cultural decay. 54% of people rate moral values as poor in America. Gallup 2025, that's a record high. Um, people are always saying things are getting worse, but they've moved from 78% average to 83 saying our moral values are getting worse. Yeah, this is an interesting one. 30% trust the federal government right now, down from 70% in the 1960s. Now, I still want to talk to those 30% and say, wait, what? You trust the federal government right
That's
now?
kind of high to
Anyway,
me. Yeah.
that seems a little high. That seems a little promising, but down 70% from the 1960s. So you have distrust across government, media, religion, corporations. They're just all at all-time lows. So you have a group of people who have walked out of the church. You have pastors that are burned out trying to run this institution. You have moral decay. I mean, we know the loneliness epidemic. We know the epidemic around mental health. We know the political polarization that we are experiencing, the way that we are substituting religious zeal for political zeal. So this is our current moment. This is our cultural moment. And we're witnessing the largest shift, religious shift in American history in a moment of unprecedented moral confusion and institutional collapse. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? A huge religious movement kind of crumbling. But then this is the good news. I didn't call you into this call to just tell you everything's terrible. Okay. So there's some really good news, and it's you've read it in, Barna articles or in Christianity Today or in Variety, a Variety. New York Times has been writing about this, but there's this stirring among millennials and Gen Z, basically from 16 to late 30s. There's this stirring, this curiosity, this interest. The questions people are asking, Bible sales are through the roof. Um, Data confirms that something is happening, and I've seen it. I was in London. Um, let's see, your last November, and to see the amazing work that's happening, even in Oxford. We were at St. Aldate's and worshiping and singing together in this church that's 1,000 people have been worshiping at for 1,000 years. And it's this little church in Oxford that these students are showing up in droves. And they're saying, I don't know, I had a dream of Jesus showing up in a dream telling me I needed to go to church. And I've been walking past this church for the last 20 years. I've never thought about going inside of it. I thought it was a museum. And now I'm showing up and meeting Jesus. And, their alpha classes are busting at the seams. Um, we were at King's Cross Church in London, and gosh, there is this amazing renewal happening there. They're calling it the silent or the quiet revival. Look it up. It's just the numbers that are happening in London are amazing. And England usually is about 5 to 10 years ahead of us when it comes to um, going post-Christian and then whatever this new is coming. Uh, I saw it in my own context at Saddleback Church. We had this kind of stirring among 18 to 25-year-olds. And the conversations, I was the pastor of discipleship, and the conversations I was having, the curiosity and the hunger was just palpable. And we had this 3-night thing. If you listen to gosh, who is it? There's a couple podcasts that recently happened about this revival at Saddleback Church. I don't know if I'd call it revival. I have a mentor who says it's only revival when the crime rate goes down. Um, Sometimes revivals are just religious entertainment with with an expiration date. But this was something amazing. All of these young adults were together. We had thousands of people on their faces anointing our carpet with their tears. And this is like a Baptist church where people barely raise their hands. And you had people confessing live in these moments to sin that had entangled them, and people coming around them and saying, the blood of Christ covers you, you are forgiven. It was amazing. The recognition, the repentance that we saw. Um, and and I had this moment. It was midnight, and then I'll stop going into all this, but it was midnight. It was about 12:30 actually at this point. This is now the third day of these meetings, these gatherings, and you had probably about 150 young adults that were still there that stuck around for all 3 days, and this is now into the night, and they're just this person with an acoustic guitar, and they're worshiping and pouring out their lives, and just was talking to a 20-year-old who gave his life to Jesus, and man was just I want to know Jesus more. And I was sitting there with a guy named Luke Lefevre, who is part of Gather 25 and kind of this whole big renewal movement that they're doing in college campuses. And he was one of the keynotes. And I came up and I was sitting next to him and I say, hey, so what do you do? Like you show up to all these college campuses and in some of these churches and you've seen this work. What do you do with all of these people who are so passionate and like have made this moment with this deep hunger? And I got to say, I wasn't really encouraged by his answer. He said, I don't know. Um, but you know who you should look at is a guy named is John Wesley. I think the answer is somewhere in like his societies and bands and classes. And I had actually just finished the journals. And for one, that made me really concerned. That we really like to stir up religious fervor and zeal and call people to moments of decision, and we aren't thinking very much about what we're calling them into. But also was a deep encouragement and a calling to me to, as I looked at that group of people there representing the future of the church, what are we going to give them? So, look, stats are in. You know, we've said Gen Z and millennials attend church now more regularly than all the other generations. Um, they attend 1.8 times a month, which is not like we're doing it, we've solved the problem, but it shows a trend line. It shows movement. That hasn't happened before. That you have the younger generation attending church more often than older generations. Um, 54% of Gen Z say the Bible's message has transformed their lives. That's Barna research recently. But check this out. This is what's really challenging. Only a third of these new believers said they had opportunities to grow in their faith this last year. American Bible Society just released this, where Gen Z told researchers their primary need is I need a guide to help me. Don't just give me a Bible, someone to walk alongside them. They are hungry and starving for disciple makers. And they're doing discipleship. They're trying to learn how to follow Jesus alone because we're so busy trying to stir up the catalyst moment that we forget about what comes on the other side of it. So, good news and challenging news. That's where we're at in America. Institutional decline and a stirring and a hunger. So, in that moment, let's transition to Wesley's model. What did Wesley do in his environment, in his moment? And let's see what we can learn from it. So, Bill,
Yes, sir.
when Wesley saw the same dynamic, right? This institutional decline, the stirring among the people, what did he actually do? What systems did he build?
I wanted to say one thing, then I'll answer the question. But I wrote a two-part column on my Substack,
Yes.
and it was called "Hold My Beer." And I thought I'd get people's attention with this. God says, "Hold my beer," because church, you're not really getting it done right now. So just sit there. I'm going to go out and I'm going to do my thing, and I'm going to bring new people to you. And now, what are you going to do with them?
Yes and amen.
And I detailed a whole bunch of areas where this was happening. So if you want to read it, my take on it, there it is.
We'll
But
send that out in a follow-up email to this
yeah.
to this. Yep.
The most surprising one of them all is what's happening in the Silicon Valley. I mean, that's an amazing thing. But it's a new form of Christianity in a way. Now, Wesley, he was. It's important to understand how God uses our birth, right? Our birth, our family, where we're from, all the ways in which God has put us together. Wesley grew up in a family where his mother gave birth to 19 children. Now, not all of them lived, but that's 19 children. You can only I can't even imagine that. But she was very strict, and she believed in teaching her children how to manage themselves and their emotions and their lives and to be disciplined. And so that's how he grew up. And then, of course, because he was in the privileged class, he ends up at Oxford University. He then becomes a faculty member at Lincoln College. You can go to Lincoln College and look up at the windows where the Wesley brothers were, and that church that St. Alden's, yeah. just as right outside the door of Pembroke College, which I've been to several times and lecturing and so on. But um, one of the people that uh, Wesley meets when they formed this Holy Club was George Whitefield, who was quite a bit younger. And so that those two guys are going to come together in a really important way in this story. But here's the point to start with. Wesley was an ordained Anglican clergyman, and he died an ordained clergyman in the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And his goal was not to give up on Anglicanism, to give up on the Anglican Church. We might look back and now say, well, he probably should have gone ahead and done that, but he didn't. And so what he did was to make this as succinct as possible was Whitefield, who was maybe that century, maybe some people believe of all time, the greatest preacher who ever lived was George Whitefield. And Whitefield was a Shakespearean kind of level actor, and that was when he was 10 years old. And he had remarkable ability. And so Whitefield, this happened when Wesley was in Georgia, the state of Georgia in the United States. But during that time, Whitefield was starting to preach and drawing these huge crowds of thousands of people. But he wanted to raise money for an orphanages, and he would go to the United States to raise this money, and he also would have parlor kind of ministry or evangelism with the elite families, with those who were the landed gentry, and especially with the women in their parlors. He would go and preach and so on, and he would raise money. So he was preoccupied with that. So when Wesley came back from Georgia, he says, hey, they were friends. And so he says, I want you to take over for me in Bristol and pick up where I left off with the coal miners. And so, because he'd done preaching out there as well. And so then that's where Wesley began to preach. And we hear about Wesley and all the crowds and all of that. So now Wesley has to figure out what to do with all these people. Very much like right now. If I ask the bishop of our congregation here in Anglican Church in Long Beach, what if God sent 500 people to our church one Sunday? What would we do? Could we do something? He says, I don't know what we would do. And the clergy have no idea what they would do with 500 new believers. Now that concerns me. And so what happened was that Wesley, he would, first of all, he wanted to have a place where people could learn the Bible to the cognitive mode, so to speak. And if in the book Conversion and Discipleship, all this is on page 159 for about 4 pages. And but what he did was he started what was called the Society. And the Society was where you could visit 3 times, and then you had to decide, and you were interviewed, and then you would get one of these. It was a ticket, and it was a ticket that was good for a quarter. So this Wesley system operated on a quarter system, 3 months, and then you have to re-up after each time. And so that's where they stood. So today, what we would call the worship service, where you go and you sing a few songs, and then announcements are made, and then somebody teaches. Well, they didn't. It was a stripped down model of that. It's not anything like what we have now, except that there's a sermon, and there might be a song or two, but it was not elaborate like that, like we would think of today. So that was, and so you had to mean business. In other words, if you missed too much, you were out. I mean, you kind of flunk out of church. Now think about that. What if we had a system like that, where if you don't meet the standards, you don't get a ticket, you can't come. Now the only reason he could do this was because he didn't compete with the Anglican Church. He didn't compete with the holidays. He didn't compete with their service schedule during the week, and they had, very rote schedule, very organized. So Wesley just wired around that, so to speak. So that's what he had was first of all, they had the society, and those were large gatherings. Then he had the classes. Now, if you got a ticket, you automatically then were in what was called a class. Now, a class was 10 people or a few more. And to go to the class, you had to bring a pence or like a penny. And this was about raising money for the poor people. So everybody who was if you joined this, then you would have to then you'd be in the class, and the class met once a week. It would be like what we'd call a small group, and you'd have to put a penny in there. I did this with a group of people here in Long Beach, and I said, you got to put a $5 bill in. And if you don't have $5, you have to borrow one from somebody else. Otherwise, you can't come. And that was my condition. I thought, why not? Let's just try it, And so, and it worked. They'd come and they'd have put $5 in the basket. I said, you just can't come here and take it in. You got to reach out. And I said, when we finish, we're going to take all this money and we're going to give it to charity. And you guys can decide what charity you want to give it to. And that's what we did. But you couldn't get in without the $5. So that was one of the things. They teach them immediately, this is not just about you. And then it was led by lay people, and there was accountability. You could visit twice. You could visit a class twice. But after that, you had to decide. But if you missed 3 times, you're out. Now, I just wrote a little statement down here on a piece of paper I wanted to say to you right now, and that's, if you haven't kicked people out of your small groups, as a pastor, you're not doing your job.
Wow.
So that's it. I just want to read it one more time. If you haven't kicked people out of your small groups, you aren't doing your job. Okay. Now that means, there were people that hated me as a pastor because I would actually de-group people. I'd kick them out. I mean, I can't control their life, but I can say you can be a group, but we're not going to advertise it. We're going to strip you of the name and the recognition, and we're not going to promote it. Just want you to know. And I was tested on that. So then you have the societies, you have the classes, and then you have the bands. Now the bands were like maybe 4 to 6 people, smaller. It was, and the other groups were co-ed. But in the band, it was by gender, by age, and by marital status. So there were 3 factors. But this is, Wesley actually lamented that he didn't have more of these. And he wasn't, because he thought this is where you take the people who really want to be leaders, who could be more fruitful. And so those were the basic system. The society, the class, and the bands. And, this is essentially, I went to school on this as a pastor, and this is what I did. When I started a church, then I was able to build it from scratch. It's a lot more, a church that you inherit, it's more like an old house that's got all these wings and everything, and you got to knock things down and you got to rehab, and it's harder if you just want to blow the whole thing up and start over again. But we can't always do that, can we? So and I think that is what it led to. And Brandon, I don't know if you want to take it from this point, but what it led to was when they got to be called Methodist, and people wanted to hire them because they didn't lie, they didn't steal, they didn't cheat, they didn't get drunk, they were a whole different kind of, it was like the crime rate did go down.
Yep.
The quality of life went up for these people. And it was because of what was called social holiness. This was what Wesley really believed in, social holiness. It really has to count. It has to reach. And so Wesley I guess the last thing about it is that Wesley had to fight to keep this system going and pure. And he lived into his 80s. He was all 5'2" of him. He had very long hair. His wife used to pull him around the house by the hair. She was kind of an awful person. And it's been told in folklore that at her funeral, and he preached her funeral, which tells you something about how much he was going to miss her. But he said, my dear, if I could call you back with 10,000 angels, I would not. And so that he was not all that disappointed. Uh, but the way that this worked was that it brought, some people thought, saved England from another civil war. And oh yeah, one other thing. Here's what Wesley fought the hardest to keep. One of the things that people wanted to do was his people, his associates, the people close to him, wanted him to allow a classification, a person who could come to a group called hearers, hearers only. People that could just hear, just come and sit and listen. They wouldn't have to participate. They wouldn't have to confess their sins. They wouldn't have to be open. They wouldn't have to do the homework. They wouldn't have to do all that stuff. And they wanted to be hearers only. And he fought it to his dying day. He didn't give in. And it wasn't long after that that, of course, they allowed people just to come and be there and not do it. And you know what happens? It poisons the pot. It destroys everything you're trying to build because it breaks uh, the moral attitude or the belief system of the people in the group. I mean, if you look at over here and these people are getting away with stuff and you're not getting away with it, why would you do it? And that's just human nature. And so he knew that. And so that's pretty much the system.
That's
And
great, Bill. Thank you
yeah,
so much. Sorry, did you have a final thing to say?
no, I'm
Okay.
finished.
Yeah. So, Bonhoeffer Project, we always enjoy living midstream, talking downstream, but our real heart is upstream, which we want to get to in a moment. Um, it seems to me that the the power of raising the bar, of having that large ask that starts with a pressing against what Luther calls the incurvatus in se, right? This curvature into the self. That starting with what are you giving? This is not just a receiving time. Has a gospel reality to it, and I want to get into that in just a moment. But just another note on the outcome. The this revival, and I think it's rightful to call it that, this stirring that ended up turning into a generational impact that transformed society for Jesus, resulted in just some of the greatest social renewal that we've seen from the inclusion of those that were out on the outside. We talked about this massive gap economically between the working class and the rich. There brought some connections there. We have incredible reforms when it comes to prison reform, child worker reform. We have William Wilberforce, who's deeply inspired by John Wesley, who I believe one of John Wesley's final letters was written to Wilberforce, who helped the abolishment of the slave trade in England, and set the pace for the rest of the world. Um, these were people who realized that living for Jesus went far more than a consumer gospel or forgiveness only gospel or all these other gospels we've talked about. Um, it was a kingdom discipleship gospel that Jesus proclaimed. So, Bill, I want to ask you this question before we move on. So, I think obviously the most controversial thing you said, besides "God hold my beer," um, is
Didn't God invent beer, I think. Maybe, except
well,
for
isn't it?
Baptist beer, that's iced tea. Yeah.
Yeah, wasn't that
Hey,
Thomas
hey,
Jefferson who says beer is proof that God loves us and wants to be happy?
yeah. Well, in
Uh,
heaven there is no beer, right? That's
well,
why we drink it here.
there's wine. I'll drink it anew with you in the new
Yeah,
kingdom.
that's
Anyway,
wine. Yeah.
yeah, it's true. Okay. All that to say, besides that controversial statement, Bill, the statement of if you've not kicked somebody out of your groups, you're not doing your job. This is why we love you, because you say very controversial things that got a
Mhm.
bite to them. Let me ask you this. What is the gospel premise beneath the idea that like you're going to sign up for 3 months, you can show up twice, but then you got to commit. If you bail 3 times, you're out. If we have that model versus the model of just come and we need to reach as many people as possible, even the idea of we're scattering the seed as far as we can, what's kind of the gospel premise beneath each of these that would be helpful for us to be refreshed by?
Well, I think essentially the way I always look at it is we want to help you keep your commitment to God. And that's what we're for. Is you made a commitment to God and you said, I want to grow, I want to do A, B, and C. I want to know God's word, let's say, or I want to know like I need a guide, is that Barna study? Okay. So a guide would mean that we're going to help you keep your commitments to God. We're going to help you reach the dreams that God has given to you and put in your soul. And that yearning for more, for something better, for something stronger, for something more consistent. And so what we're going to do is you can't make disciples without accountability, and you can't have accountability without structure. And that's based on relationship. So what we're going to do is we're going to join these little communities and we are going to aspire to godliness. As First Timothy, I think it's First Timothy 4:7, to train yourself for the purpose of godliness. And gunaziam, train. It's a workout. And so that's the premise behind it. And the second outcome of it is, of course, multiplication versus addition.
Hmm.
So multiplication, if we want to reach the world, if we want to make an impact, is it's better to have all of these people growing and multiplying than it is just to have it done just through the structure. I mean, that's the reason that we used to kid about. Rick Warren and I used to be friends. Uh, it's not that we're not friends. I just haven't seen him in years. But I said, so what happens after you get to first base? And you just stand there. You're going to try to steal second. What's going to happen? Um, and I think you were responsible for second base, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but what I was really getting at in a more serious way, it's in other words, it's growth through institutional success.
Yep. Yep.
See, first base, second base, third base, home plate. So, and I think that what we have to do is say, we're talking about something a lot bigger than that. We're not just trying to grow this church. We're trying to grow the church with the kingdom of God, not just churches. And I had an article this week on my column, which was, I think what I said was, let me see if I can do this. I think I can. Um, I said, starting the very first church was hard because it was the first. They didn't have an instructional manual. This is my best advice. If you are starting a church and have a manual, throw it in the trash. So that, in other words, I just think you got to have bigger ideas than just, oh, we're trying to, develop a small group system here. No, we're trying to change lives.
Yep.
That's enough said, I suppose.
That's right. That's right, Bill. Here we go. Uh, Man, absolutely. I find that Culturally, I think we're in a really interesting moment, and I think you named it. There's a difference between being in a post-Christian setting when people have generally said, I don't really care about Christianity. I've tasted it. I've seen what institutional Christianity has offered, and I don't want any part of it. Maybe it's church hurt. Maybe it's because, they're anti this or anti that. And so I don't want to be a part of it. And for the last 20 to 30 years, we've been living in a post Christian setting where the best we can do is try to convince people, please come check out our church and see we're not crazy. In a post-Christian church, the most successful you can be is trying to throw, some party, some gathering to invite people in to come and taste and see that we're not crazy. And so that was a posture, I think, for the last 30 years of like pleading people to come in. And I'm sure I believe that was driven by a really good desire. We want to reach more for Jesus.
Mhm.
We want to be the people who are scattering the gospel seed everywhere and hoping that some lands on good soil. And I think it also was driven with a desire of we want to build our own institutions, our own local institutions, and that became the end goal. That if we could just get more people here, then the promise is, well, then they'll start growing, and then, this local church will be this cool mechanism that will build a little factory, and we'll start producing all of these Jesus disciples. And like I said in a recent email, if you have a cup factory and every 14th thing that came out of that cup factory looked like a cup, would you say that was a good cup factory? No, I don't think so. I think you would look at the other 13 things and say, well, I guess we're better at building those things. And I think if we're honest about our, the church as this idea of like an institution that is a disciple making factory, I think we have to really wrestle with what has been the result on the other side of our systems. Are they really Jesus disciples or are they something else? And I think what is now the opportunity we have is that for the first time in a long time, maybe 60 years, we have a group of people realizing the world has nothing to offer. And we aren't needing to convince them we're pretty cool too. We're not stupid and totally dogmatic and, you know, hateful of everybody. You can come and you'll experience we're pretty cool and we got some good stuff. That's what we've had to do. We don't have to do that anymore. They've seen what the world has to offer, and it's resulted in crazy isolation and crazy anxiety and so much pain and brokenness and who am I and identity problems and all of this. And they are running, yearning for Jesus. And that gives us the opportunity to not then keep the bar super low and say, see, we're cool. Come on, come and show up to this free event we have with really cool, inflatables. We can actually say, great. We're so glad that you are interested in Jesus. And then we do what Jesus did. We invite them to come and follow him. If you want, it's kind of what you say, Bill, your elevator pitch of the gospel. Follow Jesus, and he'll teach you everything you need to know. And that comes with an ask. Jesus' invitation came with an ask. And culturally, in our cultural moment here in the United States, we get to do that because they know nothing else is satisfying that need. And the way of cheaper, faster, um, quicker, shallower, I think everyone realizes this ain't good for me. I want the bigger ask with more value. Um, anyway, so that's our cultural moment. That's what we get to live in. I want to just name a couple learnings I picked up from what Bill was just saying, and then we'll open up to some Q&A. So what I noticed is first off, we have this deep gospel question, which we need to continue to wrestle with. If somebody showed up to your church and said, I believe in Jesus, I'm forgiven, I'm going to heaven, but I'm not interested in following him, What would your gospel say to them? What would your invitation on a weekend say to them? What would your systems and your expectations of the process say to them? I don't think you can build a system that can capture this kind of generational stirring on a consumer gospel. And you definitely can't build a system that can capture this generational stirring in a forgiveness only gospel. You have to do it on the kingdom gospel that is about following him and carrying out his mission in the world. Um, so we got society, which is kind of maybe your weekend, your top of the funnel, if you will. You've got your class, which we usually think of as small groups. And I think in a lot of us, we go, man, I do small groups. It's great. The interesting thing about the classes is there is a beginning and an end. There was a particular goal. It was sequential. It was obedience focused, not just show up to a group of people who you'll love. Community is super important in our day, but where are your small groups taking your people? In what direction? Um, and it's reproducible. The class was built to be reproducible. One of the things that Wesley did so well is he was constantly thinking multiplication. So, one of the things I wrote down here is that if you're the only one making disciples, you're not making disciples. You're just really busy. So if you're not thinking multiplication, if you're the only person in your church responsible for making disciples, you're not actually making disciples because you're not commissioning them with Jesus' Great Commission. And so you have society and then classes and then in the bands, remind me, Bill, this is where leadership development, this is where there was kind of that leadership development, the training up and multiplication of those disciple makers. They would have an accountability structure there. I remember there would be a question, something like, what is it you didn't want to share with us this week? That I
Yeah.
think was a really helpful.
I had to mute. I muted because the guy that working the lawnmower guy. This all the time. He came
Always the
early today.
lawnmower guy.
Okay, here's the thing. On page 170 and 71 in C and D, you have Wesley's plan to develop a guy, a person, a man or a woman who wants to be a leader. Number one, they become a street preacher. So if they can get people converted on the street, they go to the second level, which is a Sunday school teacher, where teachers communicate simple Bible truths and hold interest in a class. If they can hold interest in the class, then they advance to preacher. Preacher candidates are permitted to lead worship and preach now and then. If a pastor is pleased with their performance, like the lead pastor, then they are promoted. Number four, new preaching point. When candidates are sent out, their success is measured by an objective way. They must produce converts. If they cannot sustain this success, if they can sustain this success, they go on to the next level. Number five, Christian worker. Upon application, candidates are evaluated and accepted as a Christian worker. Number six, pastor deacon. Candidates are assigned an area in which they are expected to plant a church. If they do not gain converts and form a nucleus of a new church, they go no higher, nor do they receive a title. Pastor is the final seven. It's the last test. Essentially what it says, can you build a congregation that can support you financially? And if you can, then you arrived as a pastor. Now that's just Wesley's mind, and that's the way that you get reproduction is you have standards, you have qualifications. Now, this has to be sorted because this is for preachers, but it can be the same principles can be work in with all your laity because disciple making is something that's done through all the gifts and callings and the people of the church.
Yes and amen. And if I'm gonna just tie a bow on that, look, Wesley, I think he had certain aspects of genius in what he did, but he was looking at Jesus' model and figuring out how to apply it to his day.
Mhm.
Uh, He looked at Jesus with the crowds. He looked at Jesus with the 12. He looked at Jesus with the three. And then, like Bart says, a newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other,
Mhm.
contextualizing it to his day, he figured out and built out this system. I think a lot of times when we talk discipleship, life on life discipleship, relational discipleship, I think often what we think is organic, people meeting in a coffee house. That's kind of the end of it. As long as people are together and talking about good stuff, we're doing it. And what I like about Wesley is he does something really beautiful downstream. He gets very intentional with his process and is intentionally moving people. So, starting out on a very simple basis, can you say in your church context, in your system, are you intentionally moving people and moving them from what to where? Where's starting point? Where is the X that you're moving them to? And have you been intentional about what that X looks like? How are you hoping to grow them? So, Saddleback, um, so many great, amazing things we've done together as a church. When you get to 401, you end up focusing on mission there at home base. It's really great. But when we think about what we were training up people to, I taught class 201 for 8 years, every single month for 8 years. And this was the discipleship class. And we taught about, Bible reading and prayer and generosity and community. And we mentioned Jesus 3 times in 4 hours in passing. Why? Because in so many ways, we're training people up to an X that wasn't focused first and foremost on training people up to Jesus and his way. So getting focused on our telos, on our ending point is going to be essential. And then being intentional in our process all the way through. We don't have to do exactly what Wesley did. Obviously, it worked in his context. But to think and get practical on how are we using these different social spaces. We talked about it in the cohort of the public setting to the social setting to the personal setting to the transparent setting. How are we using those spaces intentionally and pointing them to Jesus? Now, I want to finish up so we get some time for Q&A, but basically because of this intentional structure, we saw a movement that would have been there for, maybe 3 to 5 years of this stirring turn into about a 50-year work of renewal there in England and beyond. These windows close. We are in a window right now of this stirring, of this curiosity in the next generation. The question is, what are we going to do with it? The Spirit has given us and entrusted us with this gift. Now, I think we got one of three options of what's going to happen here. I think we miss it. The next generation walks into our churches and they find the same institutional Christianity that failed their parents and they leave disappointed. And we've missed another generation. We got some really cool pictures from worship experiences, though, of a bunch of people with their hands raised, but that's pretty much it, right? 3 to 5 years of this little blip. I think, secondly, we could capture this energy wrongly. We can use this to build growth on our weekends, into our institutions, build up our institutions, bigger programs. We get more butts and seats, but we don't have disciples making disciples. And we repeat the same status quo playbook that resulted in the Great Dechurching the last 25 years. You can tell there's a better third option. Or we look at this moment and we steward it faithfully. Now, I know in some of our contexts, we don't have hundreds of people showing up through our doors clamoring for more of Jesus. What I'm trying to name is a societal reality that's happening right now across the United States and in the West. And the question is, how are we going to respond to it? What if we offer Jesus, not just programs? I'd ask you in your church context, when people show up on your Sunday service and you call them to a next step, are you calling them to hey, here's our membership folder explaining who we are as a church and orienting you to our brand, or I don't know, go find a small group, here are our Bible studies, or are you actually going to orient them to Jesus? Are you right in that moment doing discipleship first, calling them into a journey with Jesus? What if we invite them and introduce them to Jesus, not just our programs? What if we invite them into pathways that we saw with Wesley, not just invitations to become a convert and then I don't know, give some money and fill our seats until you die? What if we stopped holding the keys as leaders and built disciples who built disciples? What if we saw a renewal for Jesus that transforms society in a way we desperately need? Wesley said, the whole world is my parish. Um, that was because he wasn't accepted in a lot of different church settings because of his preaching out in the fields. So the whole world is my parish. What if we looked beyond our church institution, but saw our church institution, this community of people we have been commissioned to care for, and we thought to ourselves, how do we leverage this for the sake of Jesus' kingdom work?
The other day I was thinking about this, and Brandon, and I thought a lot of pastors, the real confrontation that we have is our churches are like a one-room schoolhouse. And the teacher has to be skilled enough to know how to deal with the eighth grader and the ninth grader and the first grader. And it's almost impossible, but it's a little bit like that. And if that's who you're preaching to, like a one-room schoolhouse, you have to figure out some way to sort them out
Mm,
so that you can move with the people who are moving, work with the willing
hmm
instead of the not willing. And I've always encouraged pastors, don't waste your time on the non-willing, on the unwilling. You have all kinds of stuff for them, There's all kinds of stuff that doesn't require much from people, and you can do that. I mean, you have all that kind of like going on, but the real issue is how do you raise up the people who are ready to go for it?
Yeah.
That's where you invest in the force soilers. Wesley said, give me 100 preachers who fear nothing but sin and desire nothing but God, and I care not a straw. I guess that's the way they talk. Not a straw whether they are clergymen or laymen. Such alone will shake the gates of hell and set up the kingdom of heaven on earth. So there's a guy with a broad vision.
All right. Yes and amen. On that note, I want to jump into some Q&A, and feel free to just we'll hang around for the next while. So feel free to be asking questions. Before you jump off, I want to tell you about two things, and then I'll pray for you, and then we'll switch into our Q&A time. Looks like 4 minutes early. We did it, Bill. Come on. Here we
All
go.
things are possible. Yeah.
That's the first time I've been on time ever. So couple quick notes. First off, I'm going to be sending a follow-up email to you with that article from Bill. We also, if this was helpful, we're going to start doing more of something like this. We're going to, in kind of different regions around the U.S. And the U.K., going to have some gatherings about once a month, and it'll be way less us talking and more you talking with each other. And we just want to do this for alumni. One of the things as I stepped in to lead, I was just absolutely certain of is that our end goal is to see world revolution through local movements of disciple making. And we're taking a big step by offering cohorts to pastors. But one of the things I really wanted to do and felt convicted to do is make sure that we're serving you too, who've been through the cohorts and are saying, I got the gospel DNA in me. I want to see more transformation happen in my context. How do we make that happen? We want to serve you that way, and so this is a first step towards that. Those gatherings once a month. We're going to do that for free. That's just a way for you who's an alumni can just connect with each other. We'll have some questions to work through every month. But if that's something you're interested in, we'll have some information in the follow-up email. We also are going to be launching next year. If you, man, you've walked through the cohort and you're like, man, I need some help. I've you've added angst to my life because I know what ought to be and I know I'm not there yet. And man, how can we make this happen? We've played through a bunch of different ideas. Do we do individual coaching? That would come at a pretty high price to be able to make time to do that. Okay, how do we make this happen? So what we're gonna do is do a 4 month, once a month for 90 minutes on Zoom like this, coaching strictly about implementation. We're going to do the first month focus on what is the gospel upstream. Let's be refreshed with what is the kingdom gospel. Month two, we're going to be asking, okay, how is that discipleship gospel influencing what's happening on your weekends? So the decisions you're making around your weekend services, what is your invitation coming out of the weekend service? How are you finishing up your sermons? How do you decide what sermons you're offering? What does your worship service look like and how do you plan that out? How's that being influenced upstream by the kingdom gospel? Month three, we're going to be asking about the bridge moment. I mentioned that briefly, but what happens between your weekend and then life in the church, which is small groups and serve groups and Bible studies and all that stuff, Sunday schools. What is that bridge? And how can you really use that bridge, that opportunity as a catalyst into actually following Jesus? That those new believers who are showing up, this next generation showing up wondering and yearning for more of Jesus, they can walk right into a process where you're not orienting them just to Bible study or to your brand of a church or to whatever else. You are sitting down with the gospel, teaching them Jesus. How do we make that happen in that bridge? And then month four will be about life in the church. So whether you're doing Sunday school or small groups or missional communities or whatever, how is that being informed by the gospel upstream? So a link to that will also be in the email. I'm trying to think of any other housekeeping. No, just thank you so much for being here. We'll shift now to Q&A, but before we do, I'm going to pray for you all. Father, I thank you so much for everyone on this call. God, we are thankful for this moment that we get to steward. I know represented on this call are eager, passionate, faithful pastors and ministry leaders who yearn to do your will in their context today. And Father, I pray that today's conversation, you would plant the right seeds, give them that next step. They wouldn't try to make all the changes at once, but they would get one step to change. Um, Father, be with them. Give them moments of space and time to hear from you during this really busy Christmas season. Um, Lord, may you, the one who steps into our context, the one who steps into our reality in the incarnation, make yourself real to them, I pray, in the days ahead. Pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.